You're listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast from S&P Global Market Intelligence. In each episode, our experts will provide you with the where, how, and when to make decisions that transform your business.
Political change is coming to South and Southeast Asia. Elections have concluded this year in the Maldives and Thailand and are scheduled to take place in Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia in the next year. With these elections comes the potential for sweeping policy changes and government instability. What forces will shape this new political order? Where are we likely to see the greatest shift in policy direction? And how will these new governments interact with their neighbors and the wider world? I'm Aries Poon, Head of Asia Pacific Insights and Analysis at S&P Global Market Intelligence, and your host for this episode of the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Joining me for this discussion are my colleagues from Market Intelligence. Deepa Kumar, Head of Asia Pacific Country Risk. Hannah Cottelan, Senior South Asia Country Risk Analyst. Anton Alefandi, Lead ASEAN Country Risk Analyst. Deepa, so what are the key drivers influencing some of Asia Pacific's biggest elections in 2024?
Thank you, Aries. We're seeing that with some of these big elections coming up in 2024 in Asia Pacific, there are some uniting drivers. The economic situation in many of these countries is definitely one of the things that incumbent governments who are seeking re election and political parties who are positioning themselves for a change in government are likely to be focused on. One of the big things which we're seeing, which is carrying forward from the uncertainty of COVID and then into the interstate conflicts that we're seeing around the world, is inflation. So, cost of living issues are definitely something on the mind of different political parties in Asia Pacific. The second is the issue of debt. Many of these governments successfully have renegotiated or are in the process of renegotiating, and that is one of their political planks going into elections. And last is something which we're seeing more in India and Indonesia, which is a little bit of coalition reordering. Political parties are figuring out how do they want to align and how do they want to come together for their best outcome. So we're seeing some parties that don't traditionally work with each other now agreeing to work with each other, and all of these will be impacting how these elections play out next year. One of the things to highlight in terms of client implications is that the attitude towards foreign investment in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, is unlikely to change irrespective of what happens in many of these elections. Some kind of a balancing act and some kind of a revision in foreign policy and foreign investment strategies is a feature. It's not a bug for some of these governments and some of these countries. We're likely to see that continuing, but no major changes in attitude to foreign investment that could impact our clients.
Where are we likely to see the greatest shift in policy direction and geopolitical strategy?
If we look at Indonesia, one of the countries that you mentioned, one of the three likely candidates that will contest the presidential election in February is Prabowo Subianto. He's the defense minister. It's hard to talk about policy matters in any great certainty in Indonesia because candidates tend to have their cards close to their chest. But Mr. Prabowo has been known to be a person who is much more concerned about national security issues. So he will likely look at Indonesia's policy in the lens that the current government of President Jokowi doesn't. There will be more emphasis on national security, perhaps rebalancing against Chinese investment in Indonesia, particularly in strategic sectors. But of course, there is a limit to what any government can do in Indonesia regarding the role of China in the Indonesian economy.
In South Asia, these external pressures that have been weighing on South Asian economies in the last 3 years, they haven't gone away. And there's the need to progress debt restructuring negotiations with Chinese lenders. There's the need to continue to attract investment to support various privatization programs. So I think regardless of election outcomes, really, these countries will be seeking to maintain positive strategic relations with their main partners, whether it's mainland China or regional partners like India or Gulf countries.
So let's zoom in into some of the countries. Thailand just elected its prime minister in August. Anton, what are the risks and opportunities going forward?
For now, we have political stability in Thailand. There is an 11-party coalition government led by the Pheu Thai party, along with two pro-military parties. So this is significant because it binds together two political forces in Thailand that have in the past been fighting each other and caused instability for the past 20 years or so. The coalition looks like it's holding now, but whether it's stable or not, it's contingent on the support of the royalist military establishment. And we'll see over the coming year or two whether there are issues that will indicate that the link between the two forces weakening. And the opportunity there is that Thailand has been growing less quickly than its Southeast Asian peers. And Prime Minister Seta Thavisin of the Pheu Thai party is seeking to rebalance the economy somewhat by strengthening private consumption, by promising to increase wages, by providing cash handouts worth 16 billion US dollars. So industries that cater to the domestic market, to the consumer market, they're likely to see a greater opportunity under the current government.
That is actually a very good segue into the Maldives, which just concluded its presidential election. Deepa, what's the significance of the outcome in that election?
In Maldives, ahead of this election, there had been political stability for the last 5 years. But what we've seen is the new president is coming in a coalition arrangement, which opens the question of what could happen in terms of reordering what happens with parliamentary elections in 2024. The other thing is, as I was saying earlier with South Asia, that balancing act is a feature here and not a bug, which is also one of the important points on which Maldives ran its presidential election. So we'll have to see how does this government position itself primarily in the scenario of an India versus China, which then goes on to affect other things. What is the government's policy on defense and security cooperation, on climate change, on debt restructuring and its financial stability? And then what does that mean for the broader engagement that Maldives has with other players in the world like the United States? It's a reset for the Maldives right now, and we'll have to see how that plays out in 2024.
Let's turn to South Asia, where several countries headed for elections where debt is an issue. Hannah, will these elections largely be a referendum on austerity measures?
Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh all entered fresh IMF programs this year. Bangladesh secured an IMF funding program in February, and this was the first of the South Asian group to get one. And the governing Awami League presented this deal, the initial disbursement, as a victory for the government in its campaign ahead of the election, which is scheduled to take place in December or January. However, this did not slow the momentum of anti-government rallies organised by the main opposition BNP that have been going on for at least a year now. So with an election coming up, the willingness to implement unpopular austerity measures required to get more IMF disbursement is probably quite low. And we've seen limited revenue raising measures implemented since the IMF deal announcement, actually. Where we do see austerity measures coming into play in voter behaviour is probably mostly in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka was supposed to hold local elections this year, and these were delayed, and is due to hold presidential elections by September 2024. To refresh our memories quickly here, the current president, Wickremesinghe, was elected by Parliament in July 2022 after the resignation of the previous government headed by the Rajapaksas, and the mass anti-government protests that we witnessed driven by the country's economic collapse. Inflation reached very high levels. There were shortages of essential commodities like fuel, food, and medicine. And since then, Wickremesinghe has implemented a series of revenue-raising measures, so fiscal reforms, tax increases, energy tariff increases, expenditure cuts, to get the country back on its feet, and especially to secure an IMF funding program, which it eventually did in March. So now, while the momentum behind the coordinated mass protests from 2022 has reduced, protests over these austerity measures are ongoing. The political opposition has, of course, been highly critical of the government's agreement with the IMF and said it would not be obliged to support the IMF and other funding deals if it came to power following the elections. The dynamics between the election and austerity measures are starting to ramp up because the disbursement of the next IMF tranche is due this month, but has been delayed, with the IMF citing insufficient revenue mobilization, which means further fiscal consolidation is needed to get more funding. But with an election coming, it's uncertain whether Wickramasinghe will continue to get the necessary backing from Parliament for more austerity. And then finally, we have Pakistan, which secured a short-term IMF agreement in July at the last minute, which provided some relief to very severe foreign exchange shortages. Government instability has been an ongoing risk that we've been monitoring in Pakistan since Imran Khan was ousted last year. And a caretaker administration took over in August and was supposed to oversee elections due by November, but these have also been postponed to late January now.
Let's continue to zoom in on the Pakistan elections. So, Hannah, what do businesses need to be thinking about in the run-up of the elections?
Given the severity of the economic situation, the caretaker government in Pakistan will be looking to implement the necessary fiscal consolidation and revenue raising measures required to secure more IMF disbursements. And these are due to come in November and February. Businesses should be ready for some ad hoc changes in the coming months. This means expenditure cuts, including the suspension of some infrastructure development projects that are deemed not essential, and also increases in energy tariffs. But again, the political willingness for further unpopular austerity measures will likely wane, especially if the Pakistan Muslim League Nawaz Party, which is leading the governing coalition, assess that a victory in the election is not assured, and Imran Khan being released from prison would be an indicator of this. What we can say is that the focus of the Pakistani government over the next year will be to maintain a positive environment to attract foreign investment for its divestment and privatization programs. And this will include easing or removing regulatory requirements to facilitate transactions with foreign entities in strategic sectors. The UAE and Saudi Arabia will be major investor targets here.
So, Hannah, you mentioned about these South Asian countries. So, what is the outlook for social unrest?
This is something else to note for businesses operating in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Bangladesh is that there's no real off ramp here for social unrest as we get closer to elections. In Bangladesh, persistently high living costs have provided opposition parties with a platform to challenge the Awami League government, and mass rallies have been taking place in major cities, including Dhaka, on a regular basis. And these will continue to grow in attendance and frequency as we get closer to the election. Then in Sri Lanka, we also will see sporadic anti government protests gain more traction as we get closer to elections. For now, we don't foresee a return to the major violent unrest that we saw in Colombo last year, but there's a few indicators that we're watching, such as the return of the Rajapaksas to the political scene, or perhaps even a postponement of the elections into 2025. But the risks are probably highest in Pakistan, where we have not only a risk of social unrest ahead of elections, but also of terrorism risks. This will be a very fraught and polarized general election, and the outcome will probably be contested, meaning hundreds of people gathering in major cities and violent altercations between protesters and police. And meanwhile, our data indicates that election cycles in Pakistan are usually accompanied by upticks in militant activity. Even if not directly related to the political dynamics, Islamist militants operating in Pakistan will probably make use of the unstable political and economic environment to carry out successful attacks on security forces, attacks on civilians, and this is already happening. We've observed an increase in attacks over the last 3 months.
Let's turn to Anton. So, in Indonesia's election next year, the current president's second and final term will end. How are political parties positioning candidates for the big change?
Indonesia has a very high threshold in terms of nominating somebody for president. So a candidate has to be nominated by a party or a combination of parties that have 20% of parliamentary seats or 25% of the popular vote from the previous election. So we'll know for certain by the end of October who will be the candidates. Highly likely there'll be three. One person I mentioned earlier, Defense Minister Prabowo Subianto. The other two likely candidates are the former governor of Central Java, Ganjar Pranowo, and the former governor of Jakarta, Anies Baswedan. If, as we think, there'll be three candidates, it's highly likely that there'll be a runoff vote in June. So if that happens, it'll be the first time since 2004. But that won't affect the timetable for the handover of power because President Jokowi, his term does not end until the 20th of October 2024. In terms of unrest, just to add to what we discussed earlier about South Asia, we don't expect any large scale unrest. Perhaps some protests around the time that the election is announced, but nothing major that could destabilize the country.
So, under Jokowi's successor, what policies are most likely to change and what policies will likely to stay?
We think the downstreaming policy will most likely stay. So, this is a policy whereby Indonesian law does not allow the export of raw minerals, and that began under Jokowi's predecessor administration. And Jokowi has put great emphasis on this one. And by all accounts, it has been successful in terms of bringing in foreign direct investment, particularly for nickel, as Indonesia seeks to be part of the global supply chain in the electric vehicle production. We think this is likely to continue whoever wins, with the slight caveat of perhaps there'll be rebalancing, as I mentioned earlier, if Mr. Prabowo Subianto wins. The policy that's likely to change is the move of the capital city from Jakarta to Nusantara on the island of Borneo. A law has been passed for the move of the capital city, so it makes it difficult for whoever replaces President Jokowi to remove that law. Nevertheless, President Jokowi's successor might not be as enthusiastic as he is in terms of pursuing this policy due to cost reasons. It's going to cost $30 billion over the next 20 years. And because of the difficulty in getting private investment for the new capital city, nobody has said that they will shelve this move to the new capital city. They all say that they will support it, but perhaps there'll be less emphasis on the move to Nusantara under Jokowi's successor.
Last but not least, let's turn to deeper. So, India has parliamentary elections coming up next year. What makes these elections worth watching?
India's parliamentary elections are scheduled to be held somewhere between April and May next year. The size of India's election is always one to watch. We're expecting around 900 million voters to go to polls this time. What will be a key thing is whether Prime Minister Modi secures a third consecutive term. It's not routine in India for prime ministers to be in power for that long. So, if he secures that, it would say a lot about public opinion and public support for his policies, and also for the kind of popular support that his party is enjoying nationally. That would be one thing to watch for. The second thing would be, what does that do to the continuity that Prime Minister Modi has maintained since he first came to power in 2014? India's foreign policy, India's industrial and economic policy, they've all gotten a bit solidified now from 10 years of policy continuity. But election results might tell us that those move in different directions should it not turn out to be a majority government. So, in terms of what to watch for, I think one of the main things to watch is, does a new Indian government which comes to power next year come with a full majority, irrespective of whether it is under Prime Minister Modi or under any other prime ministerial candidate? That is the difference when it comes to policy passage. A coalition government in India will have to navigate political stakeholders in parliament and outside parliament a lot more, which can affect the pace and geographical focus of policies that we're likely to see, including domestically and foreign policy.
So, what are the country's post election priorities likely to be?
One of the center stage priorities for the country is economic growth and everything that comes with it. So, the industrial policy aspect of it, the shift from services to manufacturing, and ensuring there's more employment. These are the three key pillars of India's policy agenda, which are likely to be a mainstay. There might be some geographical variation in continuing some contracts, but those larger policies are likely to continue. The other thing is the kind of external environment that India finds itself in. We've seen that more often than not, India's opposition parties have supported the ruling party in the foreign policy postures that they've taken over the last few years. Yes, differences do occur, but nothing absolutely fundamental that alludes to us that India's geopolitical strategy would change significantly.
Let's wrap up our discussion with some key takeaways for our listener. Hannah, let's start with you. What are the top 1 or 2 key takeaways?
In South Asia, the main takeaway is that we have three countries facing similar economic and financial stresses approaching elections, but in very different political contexts. In Bangladesh, while there appears to be support for government change based on the scale of the protests we're seeing, the opposition BNP's senior leaders are imprisoned or in self exile, so their prospects are quite diminished. In Sri Lanka, the electoral outlook is still very unclear given multiple parties and leaders at play, unlike in Pakistan, where the situation is very polarized. The military's role is also a factor to mention here in Pakistan. Its influence over politics will only increase the longer the elections are delayed.
Thailand has a new government. Indonesia will have a new president next year. Despite the caveats that we discussed earlier, as we said at the top of the program, both countries will broadly be welcoming destinations for investors. For Indonesia, I think besides policy changes or policy continuity, it's important to see how policies and programs will be executed. I think President Jokowi has been very strong in terms of improving the business operational environment. And in a country where the quality of the bureaucracy is patchy, it's important to have very strong direction from the top. And the three potential candidates to replace him will probably not have the same focus on the execution of policies with regards to infrastructure or improving the business operational environment.
For India, one domestic takeaway that I'd highlight is there's likely to be a wild card in the Indian election, which is a high number of first time voters. If I remember reading correctly, about 5% of India's electorate next year will be voting for the first time. So there are points in electoral campaigns, there are points in how political parties are positioning themselves, which might land differently for this voter bracket, which we have no precedence for, is how do they vote, what do they prefer. So that 5%, which is not an insignificant number, could switch India's electoral outcome. That's one to watch. And the other is, of course, the culmination of India's and every other election that we've discussed here. They do influence India's own geopolitical strategy, which then feeds into the multiple themes that we talk as a team at a broader level, which is supply chain diversification, the global industrial policy, and defense strategies, and India's role in each one of them.
Thanks, Deepa, Hannah, and Anton for sharing their insights with us. And thank you for tuning in. Let us know what you thought of this episode by interacting with us on social media and tell us what else you would like to hear on the podcast going forward.
Thank you for listening to the Economics and Country Risk podcast. Connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter, and don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode.